Hello friends, today we're going to be looking at what the ancient Jubilee cycle that the Jewish people were told to observe has to do with the year 2025. So let's get right into it. The children of Israel observed time with, of course, days, weeks, months, years, but also with weeks of years and with Jubilee cycles, as we can see in Leviticus 25. A week of years was 7 years, with the 7th year being a Sabbath year, and the Jubilee cycle. Let's read about that. Now, of course, weeks of years and Jubilee cycles, they all began to be considered when ye come into the land which I give you, Leviticus 25:2. So God is talking to the Israelites before they enter the promised land. He's telling them, once you enter the promised land, start counting time in weeks of years and in 49-year sets of Jubilee cycles. And thou shalt number 7 Sabbaths of years unto thee, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be unto thee 49 years. Then, in the 49th year, shalt thou cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month. In the day of atonement shall ye make the trumpet sound throughout all your land. And ye shall hallow the 50th year, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto the inhabitants thereof. Leviticus 25:8-10. So we know that God told the Israelites to observe a year from Abib to Abib, or Nisan to Nisan, right? This would be spring to spring. But here it's saying that the 50th year is to be observed starting on Tishri 10, and apparently going to Tishri 10. So that's what I have here. There's a Jubilee cycle that ends apparently in the spring, and the next one begins in the spring. But the 50th year begins to be celebrated on Tishri 10 of the 49th year. Now, it could be the case that all the weeks of years and the Jubilee cycles were considered using a Tishri to Tishri year. That is a possibility indeed. But either way, it doesn't really matter, because what we know is that the 50th year ended Tishri 10. That was either the end of the first year of the next Jubilee cycle, or it was the middle of the first year of the next Jubilee cycle. And for our purposes here, it doesn't really matter. Now, I found an amazing article on the website armstronginstitute.org entitled, "What is the correct time frame for the Exodus and conquest of the Promised Land?" This question is very important to us because the Jubilee cycles began when Israel entered the Promised Land. So the article starts off by noting that a general scholarly consensus puts an Exodus and Israelite establishment in Canaan during the 13th century, or the 1200s BC. But that just doesn't fit with the Bible. Why is that? Because, importantly, later on in this article, it says, taking information and extrapolating the biblical chronologies back gives us a good fix for the united monarchy of Israel under Kings David and Solomon, universally recognized as relating to the 10th century BCE. More specifically, with Solomon's reign beginning in 971 BCE and his temple building commencing in 967 BCE, this date of 967 is the widely recognized date for the construction of the temple, and has been refined right down to the nearest year, not only by ancient artifacts and biblical chronologies, but also independently of both, using the remarkably agreeing data preserved by historians of classical antiquity. And that date, 967 BCE, is critical to this discussion. 1 Kings 6:1 reads, "And it came to pass in the 480th year, after the children of Israel were come out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord." From here, it is simple math. 480 years earlier than 967 BCE brings us to an Exodus date of circa 1447 or through 1446 BCE. Subtract the 40 years of sojourn in the wilderness, and that brings us to an entry into Canaan around 1407 through 1406 BCE. So there's an independent witness to this in some ancient Jewish documents that date back to the 1st century and I think like the 4th century AD, the Seder Olam and the Talmud. And I found this on the Associates for Biblical Research website, correlating the biblical dates for the beginning and ending of Jehoiachin's captivity with Babylonian data establishes the date of the fall of Jerusalem as the summer of 587 BC and the start of Ezekiel's Jubilee, or Ezekiel 40 verse 1, as occurring in the fall of 547 BC. Now what is Ezekiel 40 verse 1? It's a verse that you can date, and they've dated it here to 574 BC, and historians see this as a biblical record of the beginning of a Jubilee cycle. It's one of the only places in the Bible where you see recognition of the beginning of a Jubilee cycle in Ezekiel 40 verse 1. And it was recognized by both the Seder Olam and the Talmud that a Jubilee began at this time, Ezekiel 40 verse 1, and both of these documents mention that this was the 17th Jubilee, which implies that counting for the Jubilee cycles began in 1406 BC. That's just a mathematical calculation. So this also confirms that we should be counting Jubilee cycles as 49 years, not 50 years, because if you do 17 times 50 plus 574, you get 1424. Whereas if you do 17 times 49 plus 574, you get 1407, which is one of those years. So this is kind of like two witnesses. There's much more. You can read actually this whole article on the Armstrong Institute, and also there's more on the Associates for Biblical Research. These are great resources. So much evidence actually that if you want to believe the Bible, you need to believe that the children of Israel entered into the Promised Land in either 1407 or 1406 BC. And this is when you should be considering the beginning of the Jubilee cycle. So at this point, I want to just change gears a little bit and mention something for context. The biblical 3-4 or 4-3 division of 7 examples. What do I mean by this? Well, we see a lot of 7s in the Bible, but actually there's another facet to these 7s. Oftentimes we see that there's a divide of the 7, either split 4-3 or 3-4, especially 4-3, but sometimes 3-4. And we can see this in the 7 millenniums of redemption history. So here you have 4 millenniums come down to the most important moment in universal history, which is the death and resurrection of Jesus. So that's the big divide. And then there's 3 millenniums after that to complete the whole story of Earth, the story of redemption at least. Then we have the 7 churches of Revelation 1 through 3. In Revelation chapter 2, you have a full presentation of the first 4 churches, and in Revelation chapter 3, you have a full presentation of the last 3 churches. So 4 in chapter 2, 3 in chapter 3. The 7 seals of Revelation 5 through 8, the first 4 seals are grouped as the 4 horses, and then the last 3 seals are otherwise. In the 7 trumpets of Revelation 8 through 11, the last 3 trumpets are grouped as woes. They're all said to be woes. Woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth, right? The first 4 of the 7 trumpets are not so grouped. And then we have the 3-4 division. You can see this in the 7 angels' messages of Revelation 14. We've talked about that in a previous video, but it's interesting to note that the first 3 angels' messages are listed as such. The first angel's message, the second angel's message, the third angel's message, but there's no count on the rest of the angel's messages in the text. You often just see another angel. And then the 7 last plagues of Revelation 16, you're going to see the first 3 plagues stated, the first 3 angels pour out their vials, and then there's this little interlude where the angel of the waters gives this discussion about why God is just to do this. And finally, I'm building up basically to presenting something about the 70 Jubilee cycles and how they divide in a very special way. But before I do that, I want to just show you how the 30th Jubilee ends. If you start counting from 1406 BC and you go forward 30 times 49 years, you're going to come to 65 AD. Now that was a very interesting point. It wasn't exactly that year particularly that was interesting, but what happened right after it? What happened right after it was the First Jewish War began, and that was a 7-year war, approximately 7 years, and right in the midst of it, Jerusalem fell to the Romans and was destroyed. So kind of interesting. Just sort of pay attention to that and watch how it parallels what we're going to see later. The other thing I want you to notice about this 30th Jubilee is that within it, so if you go back 49 years before 65 AD, you come to before the ministry of Jesus began. So this 30th Jubilee includes the entire earthly ministry of Jesus Christ. That's pretty amazing. Now, before I go to the next slide, I want to note that when we're crossing over the BC AD divide, we have to account for the fact that there is no 0 year. Just a little side note. Okay, so this 30th Jubilee cycle is where Jesus died and rose again. That's pretty amazing because that puts a major highlight on the very divide point that you would expect there to be a highlight on when you're talking about any kind of set of 7 in the Bible. Here we have the 3 and then the 4. Now, when did the 70th Jubilee end? That's pretty interesting. That's what we're trying to get to. If you do 1406 BC and you add 70 times 49 years, you come to 2025. Isn't that amazing? So amazing, and it would be the spring of 2025, but the 70th Jubilee celebration year would have started in the fall of 2024, and it's going to go all the way through until the fall of 2025. Now, the fall of 2025 is what we're watching for the pre-trib rapture and for the beginning of Daniel's 70th week, the tribulation. So, I mean, it's just too perfect not to be true. Immediately after the 70th Jubilee year ends, the 70th week of Daniel 9:27, the tribulation will begin, all while the state of Israel is 77 years old. That's just amazing. That's so special. And it gets even more special when you realize that each one of those steps of 10 Jubilee cycles was actually 490 years. In other words, 70 weeks. So it's like God saying 70 weeks, 70 weeks, 70 weeks, 70 weeks, 70 weeks, 70 weeks, 70 weeks brings you to the great 70th week of Daniel 9:27 in 2025. Why 2025? Because historians who believe the Bible, that is, know when it was that Israel entered the Promised Land and began the Jubilee cycle. So this is incredible. It's an incredible reason for why we should be watching for the tribulation to begin this year.